Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Mcafee webinar looking at how to enable true threat hunting. My name is Dave Messett. I'll be your host for today. And given that we're at the top of the hour, I'm going to kick things off. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Martin Ohl and Steve Rivers from Mcafee and ThreatQuotient, respectively. And they'll be walking us all through the topic of threat hunting to try to add a little more clarity to an area that I think is sometimes a little bit confusing in terms of the ultimate goals that people are trying to achieve, and certainly an area which many organizations think is beyond their capability, given that they have limited resources and limited budgets. And we're going to be looking at maybe some ways that can be achieved, even by organisations that are limited in that sense. Just before I hand over to Martin, I would just like to mention that we'll be recording today's webinar. We'll send you a link to the recording following on from today, along with a copy of the charts that are used. So you'll get that in a couple of days' time. And secondly, just a quick reminder, if you have any questions as we go through the material today, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A box. And then at the back end, we're going to allow some time to handle some of those questions. And we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. In the event that we don't get to your specific question, then we will come back to you individually via email following on from today's event. So with the logistics out of the way, that's it from me for the time being, and I will hand you over to Martin.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. Really appreciate. Also appreciate the opportunity to talk or to basically present our webinar today. And also for the attendees, thank you so much for the time and joining us today. And we have a kind of pretty packed agenda. So we have a lot of topics to cover. So especially around the topic around hunting with threat intelligence across the enterprise. And during the session, we will look at what kind of role does threat intelligence play in security operations. But we also look at what are the different threat intelligence types that are out there and the different sources. Where do I get and receive information from? And we look also at particular threat intelligence processes, how customers adopted threat intelligence and basically how they handle and leverage that in their threat hunting processes. And we look at a couple of solutions that we as Mcafee offer, but also that organizations that we partner with, in particular ThreatQuotient, and how we've built integrations to really support our customers in the day of life handling threat intelligence. And at the end, we have also prepared a use case, a live demonstration to walk you through a typical kind of incident handling process, leveraging Mcafee's Envision EDR and ThreatQuotient. So let's start. So first of all, almost is a question. Threat intelligence is, I think, is today's in everybody's mind. But the question is, what kind of role does it really play in security operations? And threat intelligence is a fundamental role in SecOps, but it also influences other key processes in security operations. And of course, the first main part is what is threat intelligence, and it's not always consist out of data, so threat data like indicators of compromise that everybody might notice or might think of, but it also includes way more other things. If we think of strategic intelligence, or we think of information about attackers' methodologies that they use maybe to attack an organization, this information will be condensed, or which we would define as threat intelligence. Now, this influences multiple processes. One, of course, incident response, based on the information that I have received. And let's take an example. We received intelligence from a government containing a list of hashes. And based on our task, we have seen that we had already an occurrence of these hashes in the past. So which would basically start and kick off my typical incident response process, where we would notify someone and say, okay, we would need to look into this specific incident because we know that these intelligence that we have received is bad, and we know that we had an occurrence within our environment. Now we have to figure out and identify that we have still the problem. Does the problem still exist? That we start investigating it to the point of containment. But there's also another part, is threat hunting, and Dave mentioned it during the introduction. So threat intelligence is a great starting point for threat hunting. So it gives me the information that I could use to do my threat hunt on. And threat hunting is really hypothesis driven. And of course, great starting point could be the indicators that I have received, but could be others, potentially also around specific techniques, MITRE techniques, which I will pivot or build my questions around to do my threat hunt. And this is completely hypothesis driven, where you pick up a couple of key questions you would need to answer. Have we seen a specific technique within our environment? How did it get executed? Were we able to stop it or not? So basically do specific lookups or threat hunt around these topics. And threat intelligence, of course, a great starting point. Now, important also to look at what are the different types out there. And I highlight this quickly. And I think we are leaning most of the time towards the typical indicators of compromise. So we talk about hashes, we talk about IP addresses, and we talk about domains. But I think it's important also to realize that there are so many other information out there that are so relevant that fits in the domain of threat intelligence. And of course, this not only includes these technical indicators, especially operational intelligence, specific details of an incoming attack, which could benefit the defenders within an organization. It could also be, what did an analyst do to solve this issue? It could also be pretty strategic intelligence that you might receive that contains information of specific risk change within the actor space. And also important to notice that that multiple stakeholders within an organization are required to have a successful threat intelligence program in place. So you've seen it's not just only the incident responders or the SOC team that receives the indicators of compromise, but based on the different type of intelligence that I receive, it is important to notice that there are multiple stakeholders within the enterprise that are required for a successful program. So it could be that we receive technical indicators. Okay, we have the team that could take care of that. But we could also have specific other indicators or information that could benefit others. I'll give you an example. Potentially, we are a bank, and now there's an election in our country. Now, my risk will change over that time. So this information could definitely help my board to completely change and adjust the risk appetite for specific areas. Now, where do we receive all these informations? And I think over a couple of years now, I think there was some huge enhancement, improvements in the way of the CERT communities across Europe. So especially the CERT in Luxembourg that provides and produces great information and indicators of compromise, but also other information that you could basically consume. But every government got really better to produce indicators of compromise or threat information, threat data that you could leverage and use. Most of the time free of charge, but they could include multiple information as well. And of course, you have the typical vertical ISACs. So information that might be mostly targeted to the vertical that you're operating in. Let's take the example I gave you before with at the bank. So we might be interested in threat intelligence that is financial vertical related. So we might look for targeted threat information or threat data in that specific area. There are a lot of other communities out there that you could basically subscribe to and consume threat information. And of course, open source is one of the key sources of it, where you could consume information from, but there are others. And we've seen also a huge increase in the way of closed communities, so where organizations are partnering with each other and are sharing threat information with each other that are really targeted to them and potentially to the partner. And that exactly brings me to talk about the different sources. And of course, it's important to break that down to understand, well, which kind of threat information or threat intelligence source helps me to better prevent? And what are the threat intelligence sources that are out there that help me to better detect and respond, which might be the main objective from the SOC perspective. And I think the most known one is global intelligence. And of course, this information could be freely accessible using open source intelligence feeds, or could be also about specific social media analysis information that you basically consume and you could basically collect data from. And even us as vendors, so if we speak about Mcafee and with the solutions or the intelligence that we embed in our technologies, I would relate this to global intelligence, which is pretty high level and never really targeted to the organization itself. So a bank receives the same intelligence as a government customer. So it's really high level, really broad, and really good for prevention, but not really good for detection and response. And especially if you think about to improve security operations cases in terms of threat intelligence, you might need to look into these other intelligence sources. And of course, the main topic or the main hot intelligence source could be community-driven intelligence. I talked about the different ISACs that are out there, but there's also a huge shift within the enterprise landscape to build up closed communities to really share information, threat data between other organizations. And we've helped and supported a couple of banks in the northern part of Europe where they build up a kind of closed community to share information with each other. An example could be that we are a bank that we receive a malware that is targeting our ATM machines. Well, we analyze and dissect all the information that we have, and now we share that with other banks because they could be prepared, or they could use this information to be prepared of a potential attack. So building up communities, I think, is a huge benefit in that area and really helps you to be more proactive. And of course, the way also how these information are traversed are different. So it could be Stix taxi, and this is one way of sharing threat information and threat data. But we've seen also a lot of communities that are just using simple emails or simple text files to share threat data with each other. And I know also that a couple of CERT organizations are producing CSV files or JSON files that they are distributing with their sectors. So this information are most of the time much better in the way how we can detect and respond to specific threats. And if you would ask me personally, what is the most valued threat intelligence source that is out there, I would always refer to the local enterprise intelligence. So the intelligence that I build up inside my organization, either leveraging multiple tools that I have, especially if you think about malware analysis tools like sandboxing that produces indicators of compromise, which might contain information that are most likely targeted to me as an organization. But also, I'm speaking here not only of the technical side, but also of the intelligence that maybe my analysts are gaining over the time based on handling the basically multiple topics, and even in the threat intelligence space. So the intelligence that they build up and the knowledge that they have, and this information really helps me to really get better in the way how we can detect and respond and really support my threat hunting processes. Now, to summarize, especially this part, so global threat intelligence, really good for prevention, and to look at how can we really protect my business for specific threats that are out there. But if we look at really tailored information that are most likely targeted to me as an organization, or threat information that helps me to improve my detection and response processes, you might need to look into community-driven intelligence or local produced intelligence. Now, we have a lot of conversation with customers in that area that wants to get better. And I can tell you over the last couple of years, the demand has been increased in this specific area. But we could also identify some common patterns across organizations that are asking or approaching us, how could we leverage threat intelligence better? And most of the time, we could outline this in these categories to think about what is really the planning and direction that I need to take as an organization, or what I would like to receive as part of my threat intelligence processes. especially to define what kind of requirements, what is the expected outcome of it, to the point that we start seeing organizations are collecting and aggregating, validating threat intelligence. And I think to the collection points, most of the time we see organizations adopting open source solutions where they subscribe to some intelligence feeds and they collect data. But most of the time that is where it stops. And there where it comes to the point, well, how does it really help me in my day of life, and how can it really support my security operation teams, but also my threat hunters and incident responders. An important piece is also that if you're consuming threat information and threat intelligence from various sources, you will see a lot of information of duplicates, duplicate entries over time. So it's important to aggregate and deduplicate that data. And I think that is also where open source intelligence could come into play to enrich my data that I have received with potential other relationships to other indicators or campaigns. And I think the most hardest piece is around the validation. So how valid is the data that I receive from, for example, a partner company? Now, of course, there could be some non-disclosure agreements in place where you put some way of common trust of the data that you receive. But it's also important to understand, well, if you receive that data, how did this data get validated at the other end? So I think that is important, especially if you talk about closed communities. How does the other party validate the data that they share with you as an organization, that you can really trust that data? And of course, there are other communities in place where you could basically a paid feed where you pay money and they provide you with data, which could be a little bit more relevant, depends, of course, on the contracts. And of course, after we collected all the threat information, it's important to think about how can it really improve my detection and investigations in security operations, but also how could it help me to basically update my defenses. So especially if you think about all the different cyber defense countermeasures that we have in place, how could they benefit from the threat information that I have received to proactively stop specific attacks that are targeted to my organization? And this is exactly where you think about how a process could really help me, or how could an underlying process help me to fulfill that or to achieve that. I think that is where a typical threat intelligence management process comes into play, where you think about, well, where do I receive the right data from? And I think government certs are producing really good data. It depends on the vertical that I'm operating in, where I'm consuming the data from. I need also to think about my own toolings within my enterprise that are producing indicators of compromise. And sandboxing could be a great starting point to not only use a sandbox as a binary output if a malware is good or bad, but also to use the data that got produced from it to start collecting this data as well. Now, to think also about how could we use that to start my investigation and my hunting, where you think about, well, could we go back in history to identify if we have seen anything in the past related to the indicators? But could also we use these indicators to run real-time searches across my enterprise? So especially if you run specific lookups using endpoint detection and response tools to really do live lookups on every endpoint. So it's important to understand from an historical perspective as well as a real-time perspective that I need to gain to really think about what is the most relevant information that is out there that I should basically look at. I think that is where a huge challenge comes in for organizations that are starting to collect threat intelligence from multiple sources, is the amount of data that I receive. I think it's important to understand, well, how can we really start prioritizing threat information or the threat data that I received and what I should really take care of. I think there are multiple topics how you could accomplish that, especially looking at historical data sources. If we have seen occurrence in the past, do we see indicators right now? Potentially relating this also to vulnerability information from the environment to say, well, potentially there's a campaign launched against my organization and they use this vulnerability, but I know that I'm not vulnerable against it. So you get the point where you basically build up your priority of threat intelligence. up to the point where we think about how can we get this down to my defenses. And that is where we definitely need to talk about integrations. How can we get and push information out to the defenses that we have? And I'm not just talking about the Mcafee solutions that are out there that could consume threat data, but every other component I have within my enterprise that could benefit from that data. Could be potentially firewalls, could be email gateways that could consume indicators, some way of form of indicators that they could start blocking. Similar also to just simple DNS service. So we could basically also provide our DNS service with indicators that they could basically do some DNS black holing for specific domains or IP addresses that we received. And of course, the other piece is around measurement. How do we really measure the success of that process? Because the implementation of a process costs time and money. And the question is, how much value do we really get out of it? So that's a reason also to start thinking about how do we measure the success of that process by thinking about one indication could be how many IOCs got generated that are not potentially false positive. How many new incidents got generated within my enterprise that are not false positive, and how many attacks have we blocked proactively within my enterprise leveraging threat intelligence. And I think that builds up to a really successful threat intelligence process to think about really how can we argue and really support my business implementing these kind of processes. Now let's look at all the different Mcafee approaches in that area. And Mcafee, since many, many years, are a strong believer in sharing threat information and threat intelligence with Mcafee solutions, but also with others. And of course, we have in every Mcafee solution threat intelligence embedded. And for most of the audience, I think you're familiar with our global threat intelligence, which definitely plays in that area, that provides reputation lookup service for every Mcafee solution. So every Mcafee solution can basically look up a reputation from our global threat intelligence to retrieve information. But we are also developing or putting our focus in that area to provide more tailored threat information to our customers by releasing a new product soon called mVision Insights, which seamlessly integrates with ePolicy Orchestrator that provides me context of specific campaigns and how do they affect me as an organization based on the data and the defenses that we have in place for Mcafee. But we also have multiple services in place for Mcafee. So we have specific threat intelligence as a service services where we basically offer threat assessments, but also an intelligence analyst as a service, especially if you think about how could we build up our program around threat intelligence, and we have questions that need to get answered. Especially, I give you the example at the beginning with a bank where an election is in the country. How does it change my risk profile? Or what are the campaigns that are looking at me as an organization? We could have basically a Mcafee threat intelligence analyst that really does a tailored research around the specific request that you might have. We have also dedicated solutions in the private GTI space, as a specific, let's say, solution where cloud services like our global threat intelligence is not allowed. We can also completely bring down our global threat intelligence to you on-prem to basically provide also lookup reputations with all the Mcafee components, but would also allow you to make some adjustments to the reputations that are in there. And of course, we also have a lot of threat intelligence platform integrations where, of course, we started with an open source solution like MISP, the Malware Intelligence Sharing Platform, which has evolved over time. And since many, many years, we work quite successful with an organization called ThreatQuotient together to build integrations. And ThreatQuotient is more than just a threat intelligence platform, I would say, because over time, the solution ThreatQ has evolved to really help and support the threat hunting and really provide them a workbench where they do their and fulfill their investigation, where we have a lot of integrations. And with that, I would also like to hand over to Steve Rivers from ThreatQuotient to walk through ThreatQ in general, just give you a quick introduction, and also to highlight the different integrations that we have. Steve, up to you.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Hello, everyone. If you could move on to the next slide for me. Thanks, Martin. So ThreatQuotient really does intend to help assist with the process of leveraging threat intelligence within an organization. Many of the concepts that Martin talked about there are very key and important to adding value within the business, but actually being able to use threat intelligence in an effective manner is a little bit more challenging. And that is where a technology like ThreatQ particularly adds value. It is effectively an extension to your existing security stack, and it allows you to integrate that threat intelligence in such a way that it can automate and leverage that threat intelligence and bring a defined ROI back to your organization from using it. So the key here is that ThreatQ provides a threat-centric view across your environment. What that means is we are integrated with many of the technologies that exist within your specific environment, whether they be Mcafee technologies or any other third-party technologies that are outside of the scope of the Mcafee suite. And we look and work with those technologies from a threat perspective. So we help you understand not just is something good or bad, but things like who's attacking me? Why are they attacking me? How are they attacking me? And ultimately, what is the risk to my organization as a whole? So let's start by talking through some of the basic concepts around ThreatQ. If you could go back one slide very quickly for me, please, Martin. I just finished that one off. Thank you. Apologies. And let's talk through some of this high-level components here. So what we have is the ability to aggregate threat data throughout the whichever source you choose. So notice here, for example, we've got things like sharing communities, as Martin mentioned, various open source commercial feeds, and being able to bring that all together into one central location, in this case, your threat library, so that you can then look at that threat data from a perspective that matters to you. Now that means building in understanding which threat data is relevant to me, what's the priority that I put on that data, and ultimately understanding that threat data in context. Now, of course, one of the challenges with threat intelligence is that you need to do something useful with it. And so this is where this concept of enterprise threat intelligence or internal threat intelligence really comes into its own. And we solve that challenge by actually making that threat data actionable. And that means using an open exchange to build a bi-directional integration between your internal security technologies, your Mcafee technologies, any other technologies you may have, and crucially being able to capture feedback or context from those technologies in an automated manner. And by doing that, we improve the quality, the relevance of the threat data, specifically based on your requirements. Now, there are a couple of other key components here, which you'll see Martin show you in the demonstration shortly. Things like the adaptive workbench and the investigations modules. These capabilities allow you to look at that data objectively, work with that data, and you can use this data from a persona-driven approach. If I'm a threat hunter, for example, I might start out with something like a MITRE attack technique, and then use that attack technique to understand, has that attack technique been applied within my business? If so, how? Where, for example, has it been noticed? Which ESM events? Have I seen any detections in EDR that might trigger or reference that particular attack technique? So if you wouldn't mind to the next slide, please, Martin. So just to give you some idea about how this would work, we're going to talk through an example that leverages ThreatQ, the Mcafee technologies, specifically EDR, but also some of the on-premise technologies like active response, ESM, and so on. So the first thing to note here is that many of the Mcafee technologies already integrate threat intelligence, and that threat intelligence is extremely valuable from an automation perspective. There's a degree of machine learning, there's a degree of other analyst-driven intelligence in there. And it's important that we capture that threat data. So we bring that threat data into our threat library and use that as the basis for beginning our investigations. That is effectively our enrichment functions. Now, on top of that, we can start to prioritize that data as well. And that prioritization is driven by your specific requirements. Next, please, Martin. Now, as Martin mentioned, we have this ability to capture threat data from external sources too, whether that be a commercial or an open source threat intelligence feed, a sharing community, or even a government or industry sharing group. We can bring that in and aggregate the two pieces together. Now, that aggregation is extremely important because what we're doing here is we are merging automatically externally sourced threat data with internal sightings from the environment. And by doing that, we can then start to identify those specific pieces of threat data that are really relevant to us. And that leads into our third step here, which is the ability to work with your internal technologies. Now, we're already integrated with the Mcafee technologies, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But we're also bringing in data from other third-party technologies within your environment. Things like your vulnerability management tool, your ticketing tools, whatever kind of additional technologies can actually add value and context to your threat intelligence analysis. So as we move on to step 4, what you'll notice here is that we've got various different sources of threat data coming into the ThreatQ platform. What we need to do here is understand that threat data effectively and work out how do we use that threat data, not just within our internal environment, but externally as well. So the idea behind ThreatQ here is that we can capture this data, we can use the internal scoring and prioritization system, which is incidentally determined by your preferences. So you can determine what's important to you, why it's important to you, and have the system score all of this threat data for you. But crucially, we can then approach that data that exists within our threat library from different perspectives. For example, I could be a threat hunter. I could be an incident responder. But I'm looking at that threat data, looking for patterns of behavior that help me understand the threats that I am exposed to. Now, one of the challenges with automated threat data is that it is automated and actually it doesn't necessarily take into account the context that comes from valuable other sources as well. So one great example of that is brand awareness or sharing communities. So if, for example, you've been a colleague within your industry, another firm has been targeted by a particular threat, most of the time that information will appear within a sharing community. Knowing about that threat occurring means that you can then start to build a proactive approach to defending against that threat. So you don't necessarily have to have seen it within your environment, but you know it's there. And what we're starting to build towards is this concept of targeted insight. So the idea here is that we, as individuals, or your analysts within the organization, can actually leverage that threat data and build up their own set of prioritizations and insights into what that threat landscape actually looks like and where we should prioritize our response. And the key, therefore, is that we can then, as we start to move into steps 5 and 6, once we understand that particular threat landscape and what the threat looks like to us, we can then start to take actions within our environment to help protect ourselves against that threat. So, for example, if you take the Mcafee software suite, what we can do here is we can do things like enforcement actions. We can interject with the Mcafee technologies to build block lists or quarantine hosts. Using that information really helps us drive a response, but a customized response based on your specific threats that face you. Now, not just the Mcafee technologies, we also have the ability to integrate with other existing technologies outside of the Mcafee suite. And that's very valuable for 2 reasons. The first is that it gives you a complete integration with all of your security technologies and all the different types that you might have in your security stack. But it also means that you can leverage the really valuable threat data that comes from the Mcafee ecosystem within other technologies within your environment too. And then last but not least, we have step 6 here, which is an optional step, but a very important step, which actually allows you to feed back to the sharing communities or the communities that you work with. So if, for example, if you're a bank, you might be part of a financial services ISAC or a financial services sharing group. Same thing with critical national infrastructure. And by building a community-based approach to threat intelligence, all of the advanced technology that you're using to detect threats within your organization can also be leveraged to help other organizations deal with a common threat. Okay, so next slide, please, Martin. So let's talk a little bit about how we work with the Mcafee technology suite. Now, we broadly split our integrations into two key areas, that is enrichment and enforcement. Now, the idea behind the enrichment actions is very simple. It's important for us to gain context around threat data, particularly if you're ingesting large volumes of threat data from external sources. Being able to know which pieces of threat data is relevant is very important. A typical threat intelligence environment could have upwards of hundreds of thousands or even millions of indicators in it. And being able to look at those indicators and narrow them down based upon internal sightings and other such things can yield some very significant results and improvements in efficiency and ultimately response. The second piece here is enforcement and the ability to, once you've created your insight, you understand what your threat looks like, you can then start to inject specific enforcement actions within your ecosystem to help protect yourself against specific threats. So for example, the EDR. Now we'll talk a little bit more about that in the demonstration, but we'll show you how we can look at an alert from EDR, understand that alert in the context of the threat data that exists, and then ultimately determine whether or not we want to trigger an investigation from that. There are other examples here too, like for example, Mcafee NSM. We have the ability to quarantine hosts directly until further investigation has taken place. We even have the ability to work with Envision cloud technologies as well, so that you can start to blacklist IPs in your cloud. So crucially from accessing cloud tools like Office 365 and AWS. So the threat intelligence platforms spans more than just your internal technologies. It deals with your cloud, it deals with your internal capabilities, but it's all about using that threat data more effectively. One final point of note here. So we've got the private GTI components and the Mcafee DXL. Now you may already have private GTI or you may be using GTI within your organization. That is a very valuable source of threat data and should be leveraged. The key is that if you want to work with that, you can also work with it bidirectionally. So you can pull data in from GTI to help make more informed decisions, especially with third-party technologies. But you can also push data back to GTI to help improve the response that it gives you in the future. This particular piece of threat data is relevant. I'd like GTI to know about it. Last but not least, we talk a lot about DXL, and DXL as a messaging system is very powerful. Not only does it allow you to work effectively with Mcafee technologies, but native integrations between ThreatQ and other technologies via the DXL fabric allow you to perform actions like blocking actions on your firewalls or even up in the cloud should you so wish. Next slide, please, Martin. So I've talked a little bit about Mcafee technologies here, and they are obviously the focus of what we're talking about today. However, I did want to just cover off a final piece, which is around third-party integrations. Now, there are a lot of third-party technologies out there that you may wish to integrate with, and they cover a span, or should I say, a variety of different capabilities. ThreatQuotient has about 200 integrations and growing on a daily basis. And the idea is that you can plug ThreatQ into pretty much any of those technologies. The idea, of course, is that we are not trying to replace your typical SIEM or any of those types of things, but rather be complementary to it. Give you that threat intelligence perspective on the organization. Now you'll notice technologies like orchestration, ticketing in here, and this really lends itself to the concept of SOAR, which is a key component of leveraging threat intelligence. One final point before I hand back to Martin for the demo. Many organizations have their own specific processes and procedures in place, and their use of threat intelligence normally involves a process. Being able to adapt integrations to reflect your process is extremely valuable because it means that it will simplify and improve the efficiency of the integrations that you have. And for that reason, we use something called the Open Exchange. This allows you to adapt and uplift integrations so they work more effectively for you. Now I'll pass back to Martin now, so you can see a demo of both Mcafee technologies and ThreatQ in action. Martin?
Excellent, Steve. That was great session. I definitely like the perspective from a threat intelligence analyst, which kind of key questions that they need to answer. Now, I think that I want to take that as an opportunity to show you a use case, and we put ourselves in the shoes of a threat intelligence analyst that received threat information and need to answer some key questions that Steve highlighted. For example, who's looking after me? Why are they looking after me? What are the techniques do they leverage? What are maybe the indicators that are related to this? Can we determine also if we are exposed to it? So we will leverage exactly these kind of questions, or we are trying to leverage the combination of information that we receive to answer these kind of questions. So really looking from a threat intelligence analyst perspective. So what you see on screen is the ThreatQ platform that is automatically subscribed to all the different intelligence feeds, but also subscribed to my own intelligence producers. So for example, ThreatQ will automatically subscribe to the threat detections from our mVision EDR, and will automatically ingest that intelligence and combine and correlate this with external intelligence. So the key point is here that ThreatQ is first able to consume the data based on our cloud analytics. So we will apply analytics on the trace data that we captured from the endpoint, and we will automatically send out any kind of threat alerts directly to ThreatQ. Now, as you can see here from this dashboard, you can see all the information that we ingested and all the intelligence or threat data that came out of the analytics from us. But you can also see some kind of a unique value point from ThreatQ in this extent. You can see what you would refer to ThreatQ score. So basically a scoring mechanism that ThreatQ has to really prioritize threat information. And especially if you think about, we received potentially 14 low severe attacks, conclusion out of 47 indicators, and most of them based on the analytics might be low severe. But based on the external intelligence that ThreatQ also includes or consumes, it can overlay that and say, well, these potential indicators have been mentioned potentially multiple times. Potentially there's already another intelligence source that provided me with these kind of indicators. Or we potentially can see that there's a publication, for example, related to these indicators, and can tell me, well, out of these 47 indicators, actually 3 of them that I should definitely look into based on the combination of external and internal source threat information. You can see also all the associated MITRE techniques. So what are the techniques that we observed based on the analytics? Now, this data comes from the activity feeds and will be enriched with the integration that ThreatQ has with MITRE. So in this case, we can have a complete extent of the description of this specific attack technique. But also allows me to identify other relationships with other events that might be occurred within my enterprise. Now, the other piece is also to look at what are all these different events. And I would like to take that as an opportunity to show you how a typical threat event looks like. So you can see we have a threat detection from a file called the Hacker News. So this data comes from our cloud analytics. Now you can see also in form of its PE file or PE type threat. You can see also the different tags that we associated to this. You can see the attack patterns. So obviously this file that we observed as suspicious used actually 2 techniques. And you can see also the indicators that are related to this. So the hashes, as well as the file path on the system, as well as the file name. And you can see already here the scoring mechanism that can tell you, well, looks like these indicators, especially this hash, which is an MD5 hash, is pretty highly related, and I should definitely look into it. Now, we could also interact directly with all these different components. One side from Mcafee mVision EDR, where we could start activating an investigation. So we could basically take this threat detection to start an investigation in mVision EDR, where we apply automated investigation guides. But we could also start an investigation on ThreatQ itself. Now, let me explain the difference. So mVision EDR, when we perform, an investigation. It is a completely process-driven investigation. What actually happened on the endpoint? What are the key findings that we made from it? Maybe there was a specific other process that got kicked off and got started. Now, really process-centric viewpoint, and I would more refer this to the incident responders. Now, if we put ourselves in the shoes of a threat intelligence analyst, we would need to answer other questions. And that is where we can start an investigation on ThreatQ itself. So this would basically allow me to do a threat intelligence-driven investigation around this specific event. Now, let me show you how this looks like. This is basically the threat detection event that ThreatQ received from Envision EDR. And you can see that we have a couple of attack patterns tied to it. So we can just basically take this object and expand all the different attack patterns that we have observed. Now, again, this is just an example on the indicators that we have received. So, for example, we have here specific attack pattern, for example, modify registry. So it looks like this executable, the Hacker News is modifying the registry and is doing something manipulation on my startup run folder. But let's look at the indicators by itself and say, what are the indicators that we observed? And you could see this hash was a high score. So we will add this to our investigation. And let's take this file hash. So we don't require the SHA-1 and SHA-256 hash at this time. And of course, you could add it also to the investigation. So you can see basically we have now these two indicators and these two attack patterns. Now let's focus on the indicators first. So you can see this high relevant indicator. So let's look into that. You can see also that it looks like that we had multiple sources that claimed or talked about this hash. So you could see basically the reason why ThreatQ scored these indicators as really high critical. But we could also start interacting with all the different Mcafee's toolings to really answer questions like, are we exposed, right? We could directly run queries across all the endpoints within the enterprise. We could automatically retrieve information if we might have already reputations in place in our threat intelligence exchange database. But we could also query our SIM and ask, well, have we seen in the last year a specific hash execution or a download related to this hash from the last year? So we could basically query our historical data sources from there. But we could also take this information and say, well, are there potentially other relationships to other indicators? So we could basically expand and say, well, this looks like there's an IP address also associated to this file name and this hash. So this information does not come from Envision EDR. So that now this is exactly where the power of combining external threat information or threat intelligence with internal threat information by combining them and relating them together. So it looks like that we have other threat intelligence source that tells me, well, this IP address is related actually to the file name and the hash. Now, let's run an operation to figure out if we have systems that are right now connected to this IP address. Have we seen any IP address connections in the past? So basically, we can interact with all these different Mcafee solutions to answer questions like, are we exposed? Do we have indicators right now within my enterprise? But we could also relate this to publications. So in this case, we can add specific files. In this case, it's a publication report from the Homeland Security talking a specific Grizzly step campaign that are basically referring and talking about these two indicators. Now, I could also enhance it and directly look at the report in ThreatQ. Now, if we look at and after we understood the technical indicator side, let's focus also on the techniques that got used within the enterprise or as part of this attack. Now, let's take an example of the modify registry. So we could see basically the description of this specific technique. But we could also relate this to potential legitimate tools within my enterprise. So we could say, well, what are legitimate tools that are using this technique? So, and of course, the Windows registry, the rec edit, we could basically modify the registry. So it's a legitimate tool that is using this specific technique. But it could also be that there's malware using these techniques. And let's also expand our view on what is a malware that is particularly using these two techniques or this particular technique. And as part of this, this use case, we will focus on the dark comet malware, where you can see basically this malware is actually using these two techniques that we discovered as part of the threat detection from Envision EDR. But we can also see, well, these toolings that adversaries use, which are the adversaries that are using it. So you could basically enhance our view also on the different campaigns, and we could add this to our investigation. And now something really interesting happened. Now, based on the information that we received from Envision EDR, we had two indicators. Now we extended our view and said, well, there's an additional indicator in the publication that are tied to these indicators. And one enriched my information that I received from Envision EDR by combining the external threat information, but also now helped me to completely understand what are the techniques that got used, what are the legitimate tools and the malware that is using these techniques, and now helped me to really finalize my view on really who's looking after me as an organization. So, and this is exactly pointing back to the question that that Steve highlighted during his session. It's like, who's looking after me? Well, based on the investigation, it looks like there's a campaign called APT28 that is launched against my organization. Why are they doing this? Well, we could basically see the objective in the description, but we could also directly integrate and look up information from MITRE to basically understand what are other aliases that got used for this specific campaign. Are there specific other indicators or attacks that that these campaign or these adversaries are using? Now, based on this, I could basically enhance my view why they are looking really after me as an organization. What potential other indicators do they use? Or what are basically other publications that are related to this? So we could basically enhance our view on the adversary and the campaign itself. Now, this typical use case of running or starting an investigation based on a threat detection, but I think with the power of combining external and internal sourced threat data, we could even start an investigation by just taking the techniques. So let's take a starting point and maybe a potential threat hunting hypotheses, say, let's look at all the typical MITRE techniques in this specific area. Now, how many events did we have within the enterprise that are tied to this technique? Now, what are the indicators that are related to this? How was our response action to this? So we could basically run our investigations at various starting points, but also start contributing to my defenses. We could, for example, add signatures. So you can see basically based on the extent of this investigation, we could basically even have the typical signature rules, so in form of Yara rules that we could apply to our solutions. Could say, well, for this malware, all the different malware that this campaign uses, do we have all the signature rules in place? But we could also take an opportunity to take the hashes and, for example, interact with Mcafee systems to, for example, also set reputations in our TIE database based on the reputation level and the reputation provider in the TIE database to take an immediate effect within my enterprise to make sure that one, there's no system that is able to execute these kind of files anymore, but also to make sure that we're really prepared for any kind of attacks from these adversaries or from these campaigns that are launched against my organization. With that, I come to an end of my session today, and I think we have a couple of minutes left just to walk through some Q&A questions. I would hand it back quickly to Dave to potentially walk through some QA if you see it in the chat or in the QA box.
Thanks, Martin. Good stuff. We have got a couple of questions come through already. Just a reminder to other people, if you do have questions, then by all means drop those into the box as we cover off these ones. First one, referencing your demo there, Martin. It showed Mcafee's EDR with the ThreatQ links to it. Is ThreatQ a prerequisite for using your EDR?
No, it's absolutely not. So one way is, of course, we could leverage Envision EDR to perform our typical incident response kind of processes. We could even use and run and query endpoints leveraging Envision EDR. There's no dependency on it and no necessity. But especially if you think about combining external threat intelligence with internal intelligence, then ThreatQ would be definitely a key point to really integrate with Envision EDR to really support my threat intelligence analysts or my threat hunters. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. And then the second question, we get a weekly report including IOCs from our government. How can we integrate that data into the process that you've described?
Okay, that's actually a great question, and we have a lot of organizations that ask us really how should we ingest the intelligence, and it could be in form of simple emails, text files, and sometimes it's a manual process. I mean, if you receive a list of 100 hashes, I see organizations are doing copy paste of these 100 hashes potentially in Thai. But we are also able to automate these steps, and especially talking about ThreatQ is able to ingest these kind of, I would almost refer it to unstructured data. So you could basically pass in PDF reports, and ThreatQ will automatically pass all these indicators from this PDF report and ingest it into that process, what you have seen. But there are other options, and maybe Steve, you can comment on this, what kind of other options we would have in ThreatQ to ingest intelligence. And of course, text or PDF is possible, but maybe you can enhance on that and comment on this.
Sure. So with threat intelligence, you have both structured and unstructured data forms. Now, the structured data forms are very easy to ingest and they typically take the form of a feed. However, the unstructured data forms can be a little bit more of a challenge. And ThreatQ specifically has the ability to ingest emails and other such things, but we can also actually integrate directly with your browsers. So if you are looking through a web page and you are reading about specific threats and want to take some action to look at those threats, what you can actually do is you can have your browser plugin scan the web page for you and identify specific IOCs within the web page. More importantly, validate them and against your scoring and your prioritization within ThreatQ. So there are various different ways of working with the threat data. Crucially, you can support both structured and unstructured formats within the ThreatQ platform.
Yeah, that's great, Steve. And I think that's exactly in most of the time in every customer's mind and say, well, we have some form of threat information that we receive potentially via emails or via web download portal, but we don't know what to do with it. And I think based on the process that we outline and the integrations that we have, I think that we could really help organizations to accomplish that in a much, much easier way than before, than just doing copy paste, of course. Yeah. All right.
Great stuff. Thank you. Just probably got time for just one more quick one, and then, as I say, any others that are there, we will come back to you via email following on from today. But just this one more, and I think this is probably related to mVision EDR specifically. But the question is, do we have the option to isolate any infected machines from the network?
Yes, absolutely, that's possible. We could basically run in ThreatQ an operation, or basically to take an action, similar as we do it on IPS, where we could basically take a system and quarantine it from a network side. But we could also run reactions using ThreatQ. So ThreatQ could basically take a system to quarantine the host, which would basically enforce a system in action that the system does not allow any communication to and from the device, except of course the Mcafee services that we can interact with the device. But yeah, to simply answer the question, yes, it is possible.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, and with that, we're pretty much at the top of the hour. So being sort of conscious of people's diaries, I will end the event at that point today. It just really remains for me to thank Martin and Steve very much indeed for taking us through that, and of course to thank you all for your time this morning. Take care.